Good morning, actually slightly afternoon now. I thought I would begin our lecture today, our mini lecture I'll call it, with a little story. Once upon a time, there was a fisherman who lived in Acapulco, and he had quite a fine little fishing business going. Started when he was young, 14, 15, learning from his father and grandfather, and eventually branched out on his own until he had about 10 boats going out every morning into the Acapulco Bay and bringing it home to his house, actually, that was just up the beach a little bit, but he had a nice view of the bay from up there. And he would bring in the fish at about 10 to 12, clean them, and sell them off to various supermarkets and markets within the city, restaurants, etc. And his business was doing so well, and he was rather wealthy at a young age by Acapulco standards of the fishing industry. And he was approached by a company from Mexico City who offered to buy him out. And there was one condition on this buyout which would make him a millionaire. There was one condition, and that is that he would have to move to Mexico City to run the operation for the company there. And he was reluctant because he said, well, I'm done. I get up at 4 a.m. We manage all these boats. We bring in our fish. And I have every afternoon with my family. I have my siesta at 2:30 or so after a fine lunch. And then we have a lazy afternoon enjoying the bay. And so he was reluctant to upset his life like that. And so he told the corporation that wanted him to move to Mexico City, wanted to make him really wealthy. He told them about his concern, and they said, well, but you'll be an extremely wealthy man. In a matter of 15 years, you get stock in the company. You live in Mexico City, one of the greatest cities in the world, and then in 15 years, maybe 20, you retire. Still a young man. You come back and you build your mansion on the beach and enjoy the rest of your life surrounded by children and grandchildren. And he said, but I already have that. I already spend my long afternoons enjoying the bay. I have maybe not a mansion on the beach, but I have a fine house that overlooks the bay and I'm surrounded by family, so I must decline your offer. Well, this is an example of what we might call someone who lives by polychronic time. And polychronic time is where typically collectivist cultures live on polychronic time. It's also known as God's time. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Uh, we have our concern here today is with the cultural perspectives on time. As you all know, you move from one culture to another, and considerations of time vary greatly. When I was in Africa, I used to say, African time makes Mexican time look like warp speed. In Mexico, everything is mañana, and in Africa, it's next month. So much slower. In America, of course, we have books like The 1 Minute Manager. So we're concerned about getting the most out of time, but that's monochronic time, as if it's one time. And polychronic time is laid back. It's find your beach. It's Corona. It's relaxed, chilled, and you couldn't find a more different approach to time than you find in mainstream America versus Mexican time. Because mainstream American time and most what you would call developed country times are focused maniacally on the idea that time is money. So if you're wasting time, you're lazy. If you're wasting time, you're not progressing. If you're wasting time, you're not living. Whereas in Mexico, it's the opposite. We work, or in Mexico, they say that we work to live. And in Americas, we live to work. Now, certainly there's monochronic time in Mexico where people are focused on time is money, etc. But as a general cultural perspective, Mexico is more relaxed about time because there are many times that are accommodated simultaneously. But to understand it clearly, let's look at the idea that polychronic time is God's time and monochronic time is man's time. If you live on polychronic time, like a fisherman, like our man from Acapulco, you're in sync with the tides. Fishermen must know when the tide comes in and when it goes out. You must be up early, obviously, to be there at the time you need to be to get the greatest haul of fish. Farmers are on God's time. Uh, Daylight savings time means nothing to them because they're not on the clock. They're on the seasons, the season of planting, the season of harvest, etc. Um, Also, God's time is about the full moons. We used to have an expression in Texas that we would talk about the full moon. This is back in agricultural days. A full moon was a harvest moon because when the full moon arrived, you could actually work at night. There was enough light that you could be out harvesting hay in the coolness of the night. So a lot of farmers traditionally have been on God's time and in sync with God's time. And so someone who's really on polychronic or God's time, they also live their life that way, like our hypothetical man in Mexico, the fisherman who said, I don't need all that richness and wealth. I don't need to follow a progressive pattern, a chronology that leads me to have lots of money later. I'm rich right now. I'm rich in time and I'm rich in my leisure. I have enough. And so he preferred to make the most of his life right now when he was, 30 or 35 to live the life for the next however many years he could in the way that he chose to live it. He was in control. Whereas a lot of people who live by monochronic time can be absolutely enormously successful, but sometimes the stress level is huge. And sometimes they are delaying true success and monetary gain for way later in life. I have a banker friend who has an expression I like. He says, it's later than you think. It's later than you think. So if someone, for instance, saying, I hope to go to Paris someday, I want to go to Paris one day, and he'll say, it's later than you think, meaning that your life can pass you by, and life is what's happening when you're planning. So you need to seize the day and make the most of things according to a person who is a little more polychronically attuned. I remember years ago when I went down to Mexico City uh, with a group of students on a study abroad program, and I had a student who had grown up in Minnesota, and she'd grown up in a monochronic culture. And down in Mexico, she discovered the siesta. She discovered a more relaxed way of living, and she was just fascinated and completely taken by it, fell in love with it. And she used to say, she didn't, she said to me at that time, she said, I've lived all my life as a polychronic person trapped in a monochronic world. And she said, here I feel like I have found my culture, my people, even though I grew up in white Minnesota. Here I feel finally grounded and centered for the first time in my life because the culture is polychronic and works to live instead of living to work. Uh, when you look at monochronic time, you have to keep in mind that it's hard to get this point, I think. Monochronic time is man's time. It's created by man. It's made up. There's no such thing as hours naturally. We rather randomly divided the day into 24 hours, but there's no natural endorsement of that. We could make a day 15 hours if we wanted. We could make the hour 120 minutes. We can do anything. But eventually, at some point, we just kind of randomly chopped up. Same thing for months. We created months. There was a time back in pre-Roman times where the calendar really consisted of 10 months. And we got these extra months because Julius Caesar wanted his own month. And so we got July, and then Augustus came in and he wanted his month. That's how we got August. So we get extra months squeezed in to essentially commemorate the great Caesars, and it's stuck with us all this time. So it's good to recognize that time, as we describe it on calendars and clocks, is a fiction in the sense that it's completely made up. But we've agreed to live by it. And it has, I guess, made us more productive in the sense that we don't let time slip away. Again, a monochronic concept that we have to make the most of time. And if you're not doing that, particularly in the developed world, we tend to think of people as lazy if they're not using their time productively. I think also of, and this would be more attuned to God's time, is women sometimes more than men will talk about having wasted good years on a bad relationship because the biological clock, which is God's time, ticks. And if they feel like they invested, and they'll sometimes say that I spent 5 years on this relationship, I invested 5 years in this man, and then it fell apart, a disaster. And so now I have to start all over again. I wasted my time. And that's more common for women to say than men because of the biological clock and babies and all that. So that's the big concept that we're comparing here: monochronic versus polychronic. Most of your developed countries are on a monochronic time where time is money and neatly divided into productive periods of getting things done. And then you have the polychronic time that is more relaxed, is more in sync with the tides, with the changes of the moon, and with the seasons. And that's what guides a lot of people. I remember a story about the Inuits in Alaska way back, 60 years ago when they built the Great Pipeline through Alaska. The Inuits were amused by the white man because every day at 7 o'clock this whistle would go off, a construction whistle, which said it's time to go to work. And the Inuits would say, it's funny that you let this whistle tell you what to do. They were commanded by technology, whereas the Inuits, they went to work because God called them. The sun came up and time to go to work. Sun goes down, time to go to sleep. So they were in sync with God's time, and that made sense to them. But the idea that a mechanical whistle would tell them to go to work was, just crazy. So give some thought to that. This makes for a good journal entry to talk about where you fit in this. Are you on monochronic time? Or are you on polychronic time? One final point I'd like to make is that when wristwatches were first invented, because before that we had clocks on the wall and all that, of course, but at some point in the 1700s, late 1800s, wristwatches were invented, and it was really companies that pushed wristwatches on people. They wanted them to wear wristwatches, like at the Ford Motor Factory. They wanted these people to wear wristwatches so they get to work on time, because time is money. And a lot of people resisted this, employees, even though a lot of times the company would give them watches. They didn't like it because they said, well, the company's trying to enslave me to time. In fact, an expression used is they're trying to handcuff me to time. My time outside the factory is my time, they would say. I'm not one who wants to be ruled and enslaved by the company outside of company time. And so there was resistance to this idea. But the thing that eventually got America on the same time frame was the trains. Once you had transcontinental trains and trains going from San Antonio to Dallas or Dallas to LA, we needed a common time frame. Because it used to be that if you went from Brownsville to Harlingen, you might find that the clocks differed by 10 minutes, that they were not synchronized. and every community kind of had its own time in a way. So this did not make for a good train schedule. We couldn't predict when we would arrive. Couldn't make timetables. So that all changed with the kind of mass transit, and that's where. And then with companies getting employees to work on time and micromanaging even down to 15 minutes. You should make these widgets one every minute, and they would actually time them. So that's where this monochronic idea came, and we became, thoroughly obsessed with it. And you certainly can't live well, at least in developed countries, without paying attention to time. You've got to be timely, or they won't keep you on staff in many corporations. Whereas if you are coming from a polychronic time, it's a hard adjustment because, like I've had students, if I ask them, why are you late to class? And they'll say, well, I was having a conversation. I was talking to somebody. And so a conversation is on God's time. It follows its own rules. Or you might think of, I always like in Anglo culture, people will invite you to a party, and often on the invitation it will say, it starts at 8, it ends at 11:30 p.m. or whatever, or 12, but they put an end time on it. And this is completely absurd in Hispanic culture because the party ends when the party naturally has its own conclusion. It's not decided by anybody, it's not decided by a clock. The party goes on till it doesn't. And it may go on for days for all we know. So all we have is a start time. And of course, we know the start time even is quite fluid. Uh, you put start time at 8, and people will get there at about 10 often. They'll still be stringing in all evening. So that's the difference between polychronic and monochronic. As I said, good journal entry. So get with it. Time's a wasting.